Thank you, Pratap, for those very kind words of introduction, and good morning, still morning, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very honored to be here at the Conclave, both for personal and professional reasons. On the personal side, I'm a son-in-law of India for 27 years now and counting. I always feel very welcome here, and my relationship with India has transformed me in many ways, ranging from my taste in food and film to my view of the world's problems and possibilities. So thank you all for that. As you've also just heard from Pratap, I am by profession an economist. That means that I'm a member of a tribe that's increasingly said to know too much for its own good and not enough for anyone else's. It also means that I've been trained to take matters that are perfectly obvious and to make them utterly incomprehensible. But this morning, I'm going to try to break with that long-standing tradition and take a few complex realities and make them appear a bit more obvious. My talk focuses on India's population, which has in the past grown very rapidly and been something of an albatross weighing down the Indian economy. The simple point I'd like to make in this session is that India's demographic profile is now very much in flux, and that it's changing in a way that's becoming quite favorable to economic growth. My goal is to explain the logic and evidence in support of this point. I'll also stress the need for Indian policymakers to avoid complacency, since the right set of policies can accelerate India's demographic transition and magnify India's demographic dividend. Alternatively, India could experience a demographic disaster if the country falls prey to a number of pitfalls that lie on the path ahead. To develop this point, I'll start by introducing you to two recent breakthroughs in thinking on the impact of demographics on national economic performance. Then I'll highlight some salient features of India's demographic profile and examine the implications of that profile for economic growth in India. I'll then explore the opportunities that India has to further enhance its demographics and discuss some potential demographic threats to India's economy. So we'll begin with the new ideas, and to provide some context for these ideas, I'd like to acquaint everyone with some key facts about world population. So this chart that you see plots world population from 1950 out to the year 2050. The points from 1950 to 2010 are essentially historical data, whereas the points after 2010 are UN projections, which are the most widely used standard in this area. The chart shows us that the world's population doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion between 1960 and 2000. And I can tell you that that occurred on the strength of roughly 2% annual growth. Now, a 2% rate of growth may not sound like much, but in demographic terms, a 2% rate of growth is huge. For example, a 2% rate of growth leads to a doubling of population after 35 years. After 700 years, the population increases by a factor of 1 million. After 1,200 years, at a 2% rate of growth, the people occupying the planet would come to outweigh the planet itself. And after 6,000 years at a 2% rate of growth, the mass of human flesh would be expanding outward from the Earth at the speed of light. So as we proceed, please keep in mind that a 2% rate of growth in population is quite high by demographic standards and is absolutely unsustainable over the long run. Now, the green area at the bottom of this chart refers to India, whereas the red area in the middle refers to China. I'll have some more to say about that as we proceed. Based on the numbers underlying this chart, India's population is currently growing at a rate of 1.4% per year. That's less than the wildly unsustainable 2% rate I mentioned before, but it's more than the 1.1% rate for the world as a whole, and it's double the rate of China. I would also point out that the India-China differential means that India is projected to surpass China in population size as India's population approaches the 1.5 billion mark. The countdown to that day has already begun. It's only 18 years away. Now, the study of numbers like these and their implications for human well-being has a long and colorful history. A major figure who helped to get the ball rolling with respect to the study of population was the Reverend Thomas Malthus. Just around the time that world population reached 1 billion, he made a very famous prediction related to what he termed the irrepressible passion between the sexes. Needless to say, and perhaps in contrast to the session this morning, that prediction wasn't a prediction about all of the pleasure and happiness that would be born of that passion. Rather, Malthus asserted rather grimly that exponential growth of population would always tend to outstrip arithmetic growth of food production, and he predicted that mass starvation and human misery would be the inevitable result. Malthus's brand of population pessimism is still with us, but his predictions of mass mortality have not been supported by the evidence. During the past few decades, rapid population growth has been accompanied by a phenomenal decline in mortality rates and by an increase in income per capita, both globally and also here in India. In addition, during the past decade, there have been two notable steps forward in thinking on these matters. These are the breakthrough ideas I referred to earlier and to which I'd like to turn now. The first idea is the observation that when it comes to the determination of income, there's a lot more to demographics than just population growth. In particular, the age structure of population is also very important, especially when it shifts as a result of baby booms and busts and their echo effects. To appreciate this point, we need to first understand something called the demographic transition. This is a model that demographers use to describe the nearly ubiquitous change countries make from a regime of high fertility and high mortality to one of low fertility and low mortality. But it tends to happen in an asynchronous fashion, with death rates declining first. Now, as I say, death rates decline first and followed by a decline in birth rates. And a result of that pattern is a transitional period of population growth, which has traditionally been the main focus of economists interested in demographics. But that's not the whole story here, because as all demographers learn in Demography 101, mortality declines in high mortality populations are mainly associated with declines in infant and child mortality, due typically to increased access to vaccines, antibiotics, safe water, and sanitation. That causes a baby boom, but it's not the usual baby boom that we're used to, in which there are more births. This is a baby boom that's caused by those babies that are born having higher survival rates and getting launched in life. The baby boom ends when fertility subsequently declines, which it invariably does as couples realize that fewer births are needed to reach their targets for surviving children, and as those targets are moderated. Baby booms are very consequential economically. They're consequential because lots of children require lots of resources for food, for clothing, for housing, for education, and for medical care. Those resources don't appear out of thin air. They have to be diverted from other uses, such as building factories, laying down infrastructure, and investing in R&D. And that diversion of resources tends to slow the process of economic growth, at least as it's conventionally measured. But then the iron law of demography kicks in. Now, you all know this law because it tells us that with the passage of every year, our age goes up by 1. Sometimes this is analogized to a python that swallowed a pig, where the bulge in the snake marks the progression of the pig through the snake's digestive tract. It's important here because it means that the baby boom will invariably reach the working ages within a period of 15 to 20 to 25 years. And when that happens, the productive capacity of the economy expands on a per capita basis, and a demographic dividend is in prospect. The dividend is a composite of 4 distinct forces. The first is the swelling of the labor force as the baby boomers reach working ages. The second is the rise in women's workforce activity that naturally accompanies a decline in fertility. The third has to do with the fact that the working ages also happen to be the prime ages for savings, which is key to the accumulation of physical capital, human capital, and technological innovation. And the fourth force is the further boost to savings that occurs as the incentive to save for longer periods of retirement increases with greater longevity. Now, the quickest way to appreciate the practical importance of these forces is to compare the economically and the demographically most extreme regions of the developing world, by which I mean East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. On the economic side, the tall blue bar that you see on your left has a name. It's called the East Asian Miracle. That label refers to the fact that never before in history had such a large group of countries grown their average incomes so rapidly and for such a long period of time. It was dubbed a miracle by the World Bank in the mid-1990s because it seemed to defy explanation. That's what you do when you can't figure something out. You call it a miracle. In contrast to East Asia, on the right side of this chart, we have Sub-Saharan Africa, which has exhibited the worst economic performance of any region during those same years. Average per capita income growth has essentially been zero in Sub-Saharan Africa during the 3 decades between 1975 and 2005. Okay, now let's go from the economic side of the picture to the demographic side. And in this chart, what I've plotted in red is the ratio of the working age to the non-working age population in East Asia. And I've plotted that ratio in blue for Sub-Saharan Africa. The working age population is defined as the population in the age interval 15 to 64, while the non-working age population is defined as the population less than age 15 or age 65 and over. The height of these lines, to just make this as simple as possible, the height of these lines essentially tells us where the pig is in the python. In other words, when there are large numbers of people in the prime years for working and saving, that line is higher and moving up. Now, with regard to this chart, please take note of the following. First, the ratio of workers to non-workers has been lower in Sub-Saharan Africa than in East Asia throughout the entire period you see here. That's a reflection of the relatively high burden of youth dependency in Sub-Saharan Africa due to its long history of high fertility. By contrast, East Asia, which had a precipitous decline in fertility, had the most rapid demographic transition in history, far faster than what occurred earlier in Western Europe and North America. And today, East Asia has more than 2.3 workers for every non-worker, which is much more than Sub-Saharan Africa's 1.2 workers per non-worker. That's a really big difference. It's akin to a household having a whole extra worker for every non-worker. Now, for a household, that kind of differential, an extra worker for every non-worker, would tend to translate into a commensurately large increase in income per household member. And this intuition about individual households essentially aggregates up to the level of countries and regions. So the essential insight here is that fertility decline lowers youth dependency immediately, but doesn't affect the working age population appreciably for 20 to 25 years. And that interval of time is a time period in which the economy has a golden opportunity to grow. These ideas, added up, suggest that the superior economic performance of East Asia and its tiger economies since the mid-1970s is not coincidentally related to East Asia's demographics. What I'm arguing is that it is causally related to the demographic transition which led East Asia's age structure to evolve in a way that's been highly favorable for economic growth and for the enjoyment of a demographic dividend. Demonstrating this point, using rigorous theoretical and statistical tools and appropriate data is an activity that has occupied many economists around the world during the past 10 years. And that body of work has shown, quite decisively, I would say, that roughly 2 percentage points of the growth rate of income per capita in East Asia, representing about a third of the so-called miracle, can be accounted for by demographic change. In other words, economic growth in East Asia was not a miracle at all. Thinking that it was a miracle was simply a reflection of our ignorance because we neglected to take proper account of demographics. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that demography is destiny or that growth of the working age share of the population automatically leads to economic growth. I'm simply saying that demographic change can lead the development process by enhancing the potential for economic growth. The failure to capture this potential will mean that large numbers of prime-age individuals are unemployed, underemployed, or otherwise not constructively engaged. And that could trigger a demographic disaster, promoting the fragility and failure of states, and possibly with adverse political, social, economic, and also environmental spillovers to other countries. To generate and capture a demographic dividend, some countries need to think about catalyzing the demographic transition, which traditionally happens via public health investments in primary health care, safe water and sanitation, vaccines and drugs, all of which tend to reduce infant and child mortality rates. Other countries need to think about speeding up the fertility transition via the provision of family planning supplies and services and the expansion of education and job opportunities for women. And still others need to recognize that realization of the demographic dividend depends on an economy's capacity to absorb workers into productive employment, which is in turn strengthened by good governance, efficient infrastructure, prudent fiscal and macroeconomic management, well-developed financial markets, and above all, wide and deep investments in education and training. Even independently of demographics, these are all good policy moves, but the stakes are much greater when the pig is in the middle section of the python. And by the way, some countries need to think about combinations of these sets of policies to catalyze and speed the demographic transition and to capture the demographic dividend. They need to do that to address heterogeneity among their different geographies. And in fact, and as I'll explain a little bit more in a few minutes, I think India is one of those countries. The second of the recent breakthrough ideas is often summarized by the phrase, healthier means wealthier. In other words, that health and longevity are very consequential for economic performance. Although macroeconomists and economic policymakers have traditionally viewed population health as a social indicator that improves after countries get rich, the latest thinking views health itself as an instrument of economic growth. In other words, health is not simply a consequence of economic growth, it's also a cause of economic growth, with the possibility of virtuous spirals in which health improvements lead to income growth, which leads to further health improvements, and so on. Health is believed to be a driver of economic growth for four main reasons, all of which I think you'll find quite intuitive. First, because a healthier workforce is a more productive workforce. Second, because healthier children do better while they're in school, and they also tend to have better records of school attendance and to stay in school for more years. Third, because healthy populations have higher savings rates as people save more in anticipation of longer periods of retirement. And finally, because healthy populations are like a magnet when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment. In recent years, analyses of the proposition that healthier means wealthier have abounded, and nearly all of them highlight the influence of health as a driver of economic growth. So to appreciate this point, let's conduct a little thought experiment in which we imagine two countries that are identical in all key dimensions pertinent to economic growth, except that the people in one country are healthier than the people in the other. This new finding suggests that the healthier country will grow its average income faster than the less healthy country. It also tells us that a 10-year gain in life expectancy translates into as much as 1 additional percentage point of annual growth of income per capita. Now, a 1 percentage point advantage may not sound like much, but in a world economy in which per capita income typically grows at 2, 3, maybe 4% per year, it's actually a big deal. And part of the reason it's a big deal is because of compound interest, which serves to magnify the effect of that 1% boost when it's maintained over time. A 1 percentage point gain is also meaningful because a 10-year gain in life expectancy is well within the grasp of a large number of countries. It corresponds roughly to the life expectancy improvement that India, where life expectancy is currently about 65, it's the life expectancy improvement that India would enjoy if it achieved the same life expectancy as today's developed countries, which is currently about 78 years. It also corresponds to the life expectancy improvement that even the most pessimistic demographers in the world project for the wealthy industrial countries during this century. I'd also like to note here in passing the central importance of health, not just to the growth of income, but also to the alleviation of poverty. If you think about it for a moment, you'll quickly realize that the main asset that poor people possess is their labor, and the value of that asset is crucially determined by their health. And that explains why health figures so prominently in plans to halve the global poverty rate, which has emerged as the central imperative of the entire global development community. So as I noted earlier, cross-country analyses suggest that a third, about 2 percentage points, of the growth of income per capita in East Asia during the miracle years may be attributed to the independent influence of changes in age structure that followed on from the demographic transition that started in the 1960s. And that's in addition to this health effect that I just discussed. So if you combine the effects of age structure and health improvements, what that tells us is that demographic change can lead to a huge and sustainable boost in income. So now that we're up to date on the latest thinking about the nature and magnitude of the contributions that demographics can make to economic growth, I'd like to turn our attention to the implications of these new ideas for economic prospects here in India. I'll start with some rapid-fire facts about Indian demographics in the past, present, and future. First of all, since 1950, India has experienced a 70% decline in the infant mortality rate. Second, India has enjoyed an extraordinary improvement in overall population health since 1950, with life expectancy increasing at an average pace of 4.5 years per decade. And that is really quite extraordinary. For most of human history, people lived to about 30 years. And now India's added essentially 25 years to life expectancy in the last several decades, in the last 5 decades alone. Third, fertility rates in India have declined sharply from about 6 children per woman in the 1950s to 2.7 children per woman today. And finally, the decline of birth and death rates show that India is well along in its demographic transition. Now, the interplay of these mortality and fertility changes implies sizable changes in the age structure of India's population. And to demonstrate for you the impact of these changes on the age structure of the population, what I'd like to do is take you through a succession of population pyramids for India. So I'm going to start with the 1950 pyramid, which is going to show you the percentage of population in each age group. Men are going to be on the left side in blue, and women are going to be on the right side in red. And what you see here is that in 1950, India had a very young population, with children dominating adults and adults dominating the elderly. And that pattern is what gave rise to India's pyramidal shape. Sorry, we seem to have... Start it again. Okay, and what I hoped you saw, I'm sorry, little malfunction here, is that as you move forward in time, the base of that pyramid is basically getting relatively smaller, and the pyramid is changing shape, and it's coming actually to look like some of us, a little thick around the waist. Okay. Now, there's another way to look at these changes in the age structure of the population, and that is, in other words, looking at the phenomenon of the pig moving through the python, and we can do that by examining, as you see here, the ratio of working-age Indians to non-working-age Indians. So what I plotted here are historical figures from 1950 through 2010, and as you see, they show, and that would be the green line there, it shows a steady improvement in that ratio of working-age to non-working-age population. I've also plotted the UN projections out to 2050. And here I'd just like to point out to you, the UN makes 3 different projections for the future, corresponding to low, medium, and high fertility scenarios. These scenarios have very different implications for the future age structure of India's population, but as you can see, they all suggest further growth in the working age share, and that's good news for India. As a point of reference to demonstrate that, I think it's useful to compare India with East Asia. And let me make a few comments about this comparison. First, the ratio of working age to non-working age people in India has been lower than that of East Asia since 1950. In other words, the green line is lower than that red line in the past. Okay? And that corresponds to the high burden of youth dependency here in India. Second comment, India's demographic cycle has been about 25 years out of phase with that of East Asia. So a pure demographic perspective here suggests that the next 3 decades, in other words, going forward into the future, will be a period of catch-up for India, and catch-up with respect to per capita income. Third, in all 3 fertility scenarios going forward, the low, medium, and high, the working age ratio is slated to increase. But under the low fertility scenario, India will reach a higher working age ratio than East Asia ever did. The medium scenario shows India reaching nearly as high as East Asia's high point, and the high scenario shows a rather modest increase over today's ratio. The point here is that the medium and low fertility scenarios bode quite well with respect to India's potential for reaping a sizable demographic dividend, representing what could amount to an additional percentage point of income growth. Now, that's one additional percentage point of income growth compounded year after year, and that's not a trivial sum, given that the annual rate of growth of India's income per capita averaged just a little over 4% during the past 3 decades. And to dig just a little bit deeper here, we can look at this from a slightly different angle by comparing the economic performance of India and China. So this chart that you see shows that India had 66% higher income than did China in 1980. Okay, but by the early 1990s, China had overtaken India with respect to per capita income, and now the income situation is completely reversed, with income per capita in China now double that of India. Part of the reason for the income crossover, I believe, can be traced to the very different demographic trajectories of China and India. So these two population superpowers, somewhat ironically, can lay claim to establishing the world's earliest national family planning programs. India launched the first program in 1952, and China followed suit in 1956. In strictly demographic terms, China's campaign of later, longer, and fewer, and its one-child policy led to a precipitous decline in fertility and a sharp rise in the working age share of the population. Like China's, India's family planning program led to abuse, but it also led to a political backlash that ultimately set back its family planning efforts and left India's demographic trajectory very much out of phase with China's. And because demographics are such a powerful driver of economic performance, India and China's economic trajectories also began to diverge. But the situation is, as I've noted, about to change as India's working age share continues to rise, in contrast to China's, which is projected to fall. And that indicates that India is poised to gain back some of the economic ground that it's lost to China in the last 2 decades. I'm also pleased, by the way, to say that many of the ideas we're discussing here have been well recognized by the Prime Minister. And that's no great surprise insofar as, and I don't know how many of you know this, but he was involved in the research project that first introduced the notion of the demographic dividend. And he also served as a member of the WHO Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, which is the group that advanced the notion that healthier means wealthier. And on that note, let me move on to discuss first opportunities and then threats with respect to India's enjoyment of a demographic dividend. Regarding the opportunities, the key point to note here is that the economic benefits India enjoys from favorable demographics are not set in stone. They can be magnified in several ways. The first is by making wider and deeper investments in health, which have considerable potential to promote higher income via this healthier means wealthier proposition. India has taken a significant step in this direction by establishing the Public Health Foundation of India and also the National Rural Health Mission. India's second great demographic opportunity involves the acceleration of fertility decline. And in general, there are 3 main instruments for promoting fertility decline, and India has scope for improvement with respect to all of them. The first instrument is the expansion of family planning services in a way that's respectful of people's reproductive rights. Currently, approximately 1 in 7 Indian women report unmet need for contraception, meaning that contraception is not being used by these currently married women who desire to postpone or forego childbearing. Satisfying that unmet need will help India achieve its stated goal of bringing the total fertility rate down from its current level of 2.7 to the long-run replacement fertility level of 2.1 children per woman. Another proven approach to lowering fertility rates involves efforts to promote infant and child survival. Vaccines against childhood disease are my favorite choice for a very potent way to realize an improvement in child survival. And improvements in child survival, we know from comparative evidence and historical evidence, lead to more than proportionate reductions in fertility. So I'm speaking here, when I talk about vaccines, about expanding coverage of an old generation of inexpensive vaccines, such as those against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and measles. I'm also speaking about introducing a new generation of more expensive vaccines against rotavirus and pneumococcal disease, which are two of the leading causes of child death in India. Childhood vaccines also have the virtue of promoting better school attendance, better cognitive function, and better adult health, all of which tend to make vaccinated children more productive and therefore higher earning adults. And these are actually the main reasons why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation announced in January a $10 billion commitment to scaling up the delivery of vaccines, mainly for children. India stands to benefit greatly from this and related initiatives because its vaccine coverage rates are currently well below world averages. For example, the vaccine coverage rate for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, which is a very common indicator that public health people use for national immunization coverage, India's rate is 62%, and that's about 20 percentage points less than for the world as a whole. And then finally, we have girls' education as both an indicator and an instrument of development and fertility decline. So educated mothers, as we all know, tend to have fewer children, as fertility effectively raises the cost of having children by improving the work opportunities that raising children forces most women to forego. Education also empowers women to express their views on how their lives are conducted. Having fewer children allows families to invest more in the health and education of each child, thereby raising the productive capacity of future generations. The effects of education, and girls' education in particular, are extremely powerful. Although India's made progress since the early 1990s, there's considerable scope for continued progress in this area, mainly at the secondary and tertiary levels, as we heard from Minister Sybil yesterday. At the same time, and as we also heard from the minister, we must make sure we're not misled by statistics, since enrollment in school does not guarantee attendance, and attendance does not guarantee that a student is getting an education of sufficiently high quality to promote their knowledge and skills. Now, I also want to stress here that education has a major role to play, perhaps the major role, in India's ability to capitalize on the demographic dividend. Education, especially, as I say, secondary and tertiary education, will equip India's youth, both boys and girls, with the skills they need to be productive in a fast-moving and unforgiving global economy in which knowledge and skill rule. And as I noted earlier, improving infrastructure, good governance, increasing the efficiency of financial and labor markets, and sound macroeconomic management are also key, although I'll skip over those for now. I'd now like to identify and explore two demographic-related factors that pose potential threats to India's future prosperity. And these threats have to do with population aging and inequality, economic inequality. These aren't the only population-related threats India faces. For example, urbanization and the growth of slum populations poses a set of health and environmental risks that have some potential to impede economic growth. And also, as I'm sure everyone knows, population growth is putting great pressure on India's water resources, which are already in a rather perilous state and could begin to choke off further economic growth. But with respect to the first of these two issues that I will discuss, population aging, the iron law of demography that I mentioned earlier pretty much guarantees that large cohorts of working-age individuals today will be large cohorts of elderly dependents in the future. Now, if we peer into the demographic crystal ball, we see that India will experience a dramatic rise in its 65 and over age population from 5% of the total population today to 14% by the year 2050. That 14% translates into 222 million people, which is roughly 25 million more than the current population of Brazil, which has the fifth largest population in the world. There's been a lot of inquiry into this population aging phenomenon, especially its implications for economic growth. Much of the existing commentary is highly alarmist. As just one example, Peter Peterson, who's former CEO of the now defunct Lehman Brothers, he was also Secretary of Commerce in the US and a chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. He set off a rather serious alarm in a 1999 Foreign Affairs article in which he described global aging, and I quote, as a threat more grave and certain than those posed by chemical weapons, nuclear proliferation, or ethnic strife. Now, Peterson's concern here is that many countries, including India, by the way, will in coming years be flooded with elderly individuals who will endeavor to consume more than they contribute, and that shift will dramatically alter asset values and the income trajectories that people and nations have come to expect. My own views are much less alarmist than those of Peterson, and certainly with respect to India's prospects. First of all, India's 65 and over crowd currently represents only about a fourth of the number of its adolescents and young adults, and it's not going to come to outnumber the younger group for nearly 40 years. Population aging is important, but it's also important that we not lose sight of the fact that the education and training needs of India's adolescents and young adults is truly the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Taking good care of that generation today will make it much easier to attend to growing numbers of older Indians in the future. Now, it's true that adult labor force participation rates will tend to decrease as populations age. But the burden of old age dependency will be substantially offset by the decline in youth dependency associated with declining fertility. In addition, there are a host of behavioral and policy responses to population aging, including higher labor force participation of women, higher savings for retirement, later age of retirement, and possibly increased migration from labor surplus to labor deficit countries. And all of these responses suggest that population aging will not necessarily impede economic growth. So in other words, I am not particularly worried about India having to return its demographic dividend anytime soon, or perhaps ever, as a result of population aging. I'm also not worried that wealthy industrial country markets for goods and services produced by India will collapse under the weight of population aging. Notwithstanding, though, its likely modest effect on economic growth in India, population aging is going to create a significant challenge here, given mainly the challenge arises because of the current reliance of India on private family networks for providing the elderly with care, companionship, and financial support. That private system will not be able to withstand the increased number of older Indians, especially given increased female labor force participation, smaller numbers of more mobile children, widening generation gaps, and a tidal wave of costly-to-treat non-communicable diseases like diabetes, cancer, and stroke. Under such circumstances, people normally look to the state for assistance. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. And when it does, if something is not done, people are going to be greeted by a policy vacuum, because less than 10% of the Indian population has health insurance, either public or private, and 90% of the elderly have no pension. Now, I would say, is the time for India to build an evidence base on population aging and to use it to devise a set of related public institutions. I'd also note, as John Chambers reminded us yesterday, that challenges associated with market shifts like global population aging often bring opportunities with them. And I believe that India will have an array of new needs on which, and I believe that this generation of elderly will have an array of new needs on which India can capitalize, from managing and creating long-term care facilities, to specialized financial products, to anti-aging products, to different types of recreational activities. Now, thus far, I've spoken about India as if it were a homogeneous entity, but that is hardly a good description, because India, as we all know, encompasses numerous sources of potential heterogeneity in the form of language, religion, caste, income, education, perspective, the list goes on and on. Sometimes heterogeneity can be the cause of social and political unrest and instability. Now, a full discussion of inequality in India is beyond the scope of what we have time for here, but I'd like to alert everyone briefly to the magnitude of cross-state demographic heterogeneity as a possible source of potentially destabilizing economic inequality. So this chart here shows cross-state differences in our main indicator of potential for a demographic dividend, namely the ratio of the working age population to the non-working age population. I'm sorry if it's a little hard to read, but let me just tell you that the comparison of Tamil Nadu and Bihar shows as great a disparity as the current difference between Ireland and Rwanda. In other words, Tamil Nadu's economy is getting much more demographic lift than is Bihar. Other demographic indicators show a similarly large range of heterogeneity. For example, in 2001, the total fertility rate varied across the states of India by a factor of more than 3. Fertility in Kerala, for example, is well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, whereas it was more than twice the replacement level in Uttar Pradesh. This disparity corresponds roughly to the current difference in fertility between Japan and Kenya. Cross-state variation in life expectancy is also huge. In 2001, Kerala stood at one extreme, at 73 years. At the other extreme was Madhya Pradesh, at 59. That disparity is comparable to the current difference between Hungary and Senegal. Insofar as demographic cycles induce economic cycles by the arguments we've just gone through, the extraordinary degree of demographic heterogeneity within India suggests economic trajectories across states that are as different as those we saw before between East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. My worry here is that economic growth rates could vary so much by state as to exacerbate greatly economic inequality in India, and that actually brings us back full circle to our discussion of the politics of progress yesterday. Okay, and now I'll just draw my remarks to a close and recap the 4 key messages I hope you'll take away with you from this session. Okay, so, first message, demographics matter. They matter to the pace and the process of economic growth and development. Second message, demographics matter a lot. Lots of factors influence economic growth, but there's not much out there that's more important and reliable than demography. Third message, India's changing demographics are creating a strong and potentially quite strong impulse for economic growth and therefore also for the reduction of poverty. And finally, I'll just borrow some words from Nandan Nilekani, whose best-selling book, Imagining India, sets forth quite a brilliant vision for the country that's anchored by the intelligent management of its demographic assets. As put by Nandan, the demographic dividend could well become a demographic disaster if we do not make the right investments. We have this beautiful opportunity. Let us not mess it up. Simple, to the point, and I would say spot on correct. So thank you, Nandan, and thank you all.